Hi there, I'm Kathy Dawson. I am one of the tutors with Seeds of Literacy, and today's lesson is a continuation of last week's lesson, which was on punctuation. I believe we went over maybe 5 or 6 types of punctuation, perhaps even 7 last time. I'm going to add 6 more on this week. But in general, when we talk about punctuation when you're reading something or you're writing something, it has to do with giving some kind of rhythm to what you're reading or what you're writing. So it has to do with pacing. So, for example, the period, you can use for a long sentence or you can use for a short sentence. So, commas, you can make your sentence longer with commas in them. So, some of these have the same kind of aspect to them. But the first one we're going to talk about is quotation marks. Now, we use this, or you'll read this when someone, a character in a story that you're reading, is most likely saying something. Okay, so I'm going to show you what this looks like. So say you're reading, whoops, let me get on the page. That would be helpful. Okay, say you're reading, he stood up and said, now there's a comma there, and then you have a quotation mark. It is so nice to meet you. Okay, now this gets a little tricky because there are 2 thoughts on this. You can put your period before the quotation mark, or you can put it after the quotation mark. The key here is whichever one you decide to use, that you stay consistent when you're writing anything. When you're reading something, especially if it's literature, you're going to see that the period or whatever the quotation mark is consistently inside or outside of the quotation mark. Now, I personally, I always put it inside. I don't know why, it just looks better for me. So that's just what I do. So, for example, if you said, here's something you want to avoid writing. Like if you said, the doctor said, you look like you've healed. Okay, period, quotation mark. And then if the next sentence said, the nurse said, yes, you look well, quotation mark, period. I'm doing this so you can see what you don't want to do. And you're probably not going to read this in something that looks like this, right? Because see, it's different. The first sentence has the period with the quotation mark. The second sentence has the quotation mark with the period. It's not consistent. So whichever one you use, you want to be consistent. And you'll notice this when you're reading. I hope you do it anyway. Okay, that's so much for quotation marks for right now. Now we are going to go on to what's called parentheses. Now, parentheses can be used in a variety of ways. An example is if you are using it with some kind of date. So if you're reading a story or reading information and you see something like Abraham Lincoln, and then next to it is parentheses, I had to look this up, by the way, 1809 to 1865, okay? That's an example of how you can use a parentheses, somebody's birth date and the date they died. Another example is if you're setting off some kind of instruction or you're reading instructions, okay? It would look something like this. This is just an example. The patterns in the weather were significant. Okay. And then you might see a parentheses and it might say, see figure 5. Okay. So it's directing you to go somewhere else in relation to the sentence that you just read. But that's another example of how you'll see a parentheses in what you're reading. The last one going to talk about is a parentheses that gives you an option. So if you see something like or suggestions. Now notice I don't put a space in there because you don't need a space. So right after the last letter is the S. And then it'll say here, and then as you learned last week, we put a colon because you're going to then write your suggestions. It might be 1 without the S, or it might be 3 with the S. So that's another example of how to use parentheses. There are several ways to do it. So I don't want to overload you too much on this. So we're going to move on to the next type of punctuation, which I know you know this one, question mark. Okay, this is easy. I think it's easy. A question mark is at the end of a sentence that's asking something, right? So you have very simple things. This is where you want a response from someone. What time is it? Okay. How old are you? You can use it with longer sentences. Could you tell me how to get to the train station? Okay. So short, long sentences, whatever you want to do. Now, here's another way you can see, and I'm sure you've read this, just one word. What? You know, what? So it's kind of fun. I love punctuation because it can really make reading and writing fun. You know, if we were just reading a story that had every sentence had 5 words in it and a period, you'd fall asleep. I mean, it would just be monotonous, right? But if you can make the sentence longer and stick a comma in there, or throw in a question, right? Or add some information that has parentheses around it, just visually, it makes reading more fun. Okay, the next one is also a fun type of punctuation. It's an exclamation point. Boop. Okay, so you use this if you're going to add emotion to a sentence, or you're reading a sentence that has emotion to it, or you want to give emphasis to something. You really want to make a point. So you're going to see things like, this would be me, by the way. There's a spider, okay? So what you're saying is, there's a spider. So you use the exclamation point. Or you might say, it's so hot in here. Exclamation point. What you're doing is it's not just hot in here, it's so hot in here. You're really emphasizing it. Another way to use it, if you want to give the idea that you're screaming or saying something loudly. So if you read something that said, the man screamed, now you get to use the quotation marks in here, comma, quotation mark, stop. That tells you, well, the word scream tells you too. But stop with an exclamation point. Even if you didn't use the word screamed and you just said the man said stop, if you see the exclamation point, he's saying it really strongly. All right. Okay, so those are fun to use. The next one we're going to talk about is called the hyphen, otherwise known as, now I'm here to use another way to use a parentheses, is otherwise known as a dash. Okay. Or you could say hyphen, hyphen slash dash, dash. This is what I love about writing because it's just so fun. And reading. Now, this is interesting because you can use a hyphen to make what's called a multiple adjective. All right, stick with me on this. I know it sounds a little complicated, but here's an example. If you said, he's a, well, no, let me do this one different. This is, if you wrote this is a 1-way street. You're using what's called a multiple adjective. It's, what kind of street is it? It's a 1-way street. It's describing the street. Now, the way you know that you have to use a hyphen is you get rid of one of the words and see if it makes sense. This is a 1 street. That doesn't make sense, right? Okay, or if you say this is a way street, that doesn't make sense. So what you need to do is say this is a 1-way street. that makes sense. Okay, another example is, let's see. Okay, this is interesting. If you were to say, he's a 2-year-old child. Okay, you are describing the noun, which is the child. Okay, and the multiple adjective here is before the noun. Now, if you use the multiple, if you say, let's see, the child is 2 years old, notice there are no hyphens, okay, because the child, which is the noun, is before the multiple adjective or what you're describing the child as. So when you're describing what the child is, multiple adjective before the noun, the child, you use the hyphens. If you're doing it after the noun, the child, no hyphens. Okay? All right. So once again, this is one of those little punctuation mark. Gosh, I can't say punctuation marks that breaks up the monotony of sentences and gives it kind of a flavor. You know, it gives you another way of hearing it when you're reading something or writing something. Okay, we're going to do one more, and this is kind of a fun one. This is called it's fun to say, ellipses. Ellipses or ellipses marks. Now, these are used in 3 ways, and this is what it looks like. I'll get the dash out of there. So an ellipses mark looks like this: 1, 2, 3. I know you've seen it when you've read it, but I want to explain what it means. So it's used if you're going to slow down your voice. For example, when you're talking to someone and you say, I forgot. The space in between and forgot is the ellipses. So I'll write this: I, comma, ellipses, forgot to walk the dog. Okay. So when you see those, and there's a space on either side of the ellipses. When you see those 3 dots, know in your head when you're reading that the person is pausing. Okay. Another way it's used is, is when you are eliminating or leaving out some information in a sentence. For example, if you were to say, to be or not, comma, that is the question. This is a quote from Shakespeare. So to be or not to be, that is the question. So to be is missing, right? So that's why you use the 3 dots. That one you don't see as often, but you might. So that's why I included it. Another one, I use this one a lot in emails. Like if I'm sharing an emotion to someone I'm writing to. For example, I had a friend who lost her mom recently. And so I sent her an email and I said, I am so sorry to hear of the loss of your mom, What I'm trying to have her get the sense of is that I am thinking of her and she's in my heart. And so these 3 little dots toward the end of a sentence can really leave the person feeling like, oh wow, you know, I'm in their mind. So it's a good way to express that. Or you can just simply say, while you've been away, I think, that doesn't make sense. While you've been away, I have thought of you a lot. Again, I want you to know you're in my mind. It has to do with thinking or feeling. Those are called the ellipses. So I think I've shared with you between last week and this week, I think I've shared with you, if not all, pretty much all of the Punctuation you're going to see when you're reading or when you're writing. I do want to share with you a YouTube video that I think would be very helpful. It's called, notice I'm using a colon here. It's called Oxford on hyphen, because this is a double, or well, it's a multiple adjective. In this case, it's a double adjective. Online English. Okay, so if you go to YouTube and you put in Oxford Online English, you're going to get everything I taught you last week and this week. So I hope you enjoyed the lesson. Have a wonderful day.